Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. It's a joy to be back with you as we start a new year together. We kick off our 2021 series with an interview I recorded last spring with critically acclaimed pianist Helen Sung. In a few moments, you're going to hear about her own journey of musical discovery, from growing up with her parents in Houston, Texas, to forging a full-time career as a performer and educator in New York City. Helen will also share her own insight on how her training in classical music went on to influence her efforts as a jazz pianist. Our conversation begins with this question: when did you first discover the piano?
I was first introduced, I think I was around 4 or 5. Although technically, when I was maybe 3, I remember a little red toy piano showed up. About a foot long, had about 12 keys. Each of them were a different color. And at that point, I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And at that point, it was just me and my younger sister. And I don't know if it was supposed to be for both of us, but I took that thing and I remember walking, I have memories of walking around with it under my arm, holding it. And I don't remember this other part, but my mom said she would hear me play melodies I heard off the TV or radio. And so when my parents had friends who were moving back to Taiwan and they needed to do something with their upright piano, my parents said, oh, well, let's get it for Helen. She's showing interest. So I started taking lessons when I was around 5 in classical piano, and also violin too at the same time. So I was pretty young.
Violin. Do you still play violin, or was that something of the past?
I still play. I mean, I wouldn't play in public now. Maybe for recordings if I could edit it heavily, because it's hard, you know. I mean, I still have my violin. Every now and then I pull it out and play some notes. Sadly, because I just don't have the time. But I mean, this is kind of going out of sequence. But I'm really grateful and so excited. New York City started under New York Foundation for the Arts, NYFA. They started a new grant called NYC Women's Fund, which are grants specifically for women to produce work in movies, theater, and music. And I got one for this year. Thank you so much. It was announced in March. And my project was quartet squared, double quartet, because I've always wanted to write for a string quartet. So I'm arranging music and writing music for my jazz quartet, playing along with a string quartet. So maybe I'll have more violin activity in a while.
So not only have your parents played an important role in encouraging you to continue your musical endeavors, but they also gave you a sense of purpose, a sense of who you are. And their own story plays greatly into that. Would you tell us about how they arrived in Houston, Texas?
Sure. My dad came. They were both born in China, but they met in Taiwan where they grew up. And my dad came to Texas, Rice University specifically, to get a master's. And he and my mom had just gotten married, and she soon followed him to the States. So, you know, when I think about it, I have so much respect for them and what they did, you know, coming to a foreign country where they don't speak the language, especially my mom, you know, and making a life. I remember asking my dad, because we lived in Columbus, Ohio for a few years when he went to get his doctorate. And then I remember them waking me up one morning saying, we're going. And they had tied the mattresses on the top of the Dodge Coronet that we had at the time, and just driving from Ohio to Houston. And I remember asking him, well, what did you do when you got here? And he said, well, checked us into a hotel, and he started work and eventually found an apartment. I mean, that is just, you know, just really much respect. I think in retrospect, they might have regretted starting me on piano because they really didn't want me to continue it in terms of, you know, choosing career choice. They wanted me to, you know, they're very practical immigrants. They didn't know any artists. We didn't know any people who didn't work for a boss. So I think I think now they are starting to get it. You know, they'll never love jazz music, but I think they see how fulfilling it is for me and how much I love doing it, and I think that helps them on the road to acceptance. But, they instilled in me the, work ethic, probably just very high expectations of myself and discipline, it's kind of a stereotype, right? All the Asian stereotypical things. So, but, I used to get really upset when I felt like they weren't supporting me wanting to become a musician, because my dad would mail me newspaper clippings or magazine articles about folks who were very successful doctors or lawyers or scientists who used to be music majors, and I would get so upset. But, I really, now that I'm older, I just really thank them for working so hard to give me and my siblings the kind of life where we could have music lessons, which it's a blessing. It's a luxury, and
mm-hmm. Let's dig into your early musical experience. You began classical piano lessons at a very young age 4 or 5. What were some of the things you were learning and some of the composers that you were studying at that time?
Well, when I was 9, I shifted from my first teacher, who was wonderful, and she gave me a solid technique. I remember my second teacher saying, "You're the first student, you and your siblings are the first students where I didn't have to remake their technique." She was a very stern, serious lady, Russian lady of the Russian school. You took lessons. You know how the dynamic in a classical piano teacher-student relationship is very unique. It's very intense, a little bit controlling, and she was a very domineering lady. So I was schooled in all the great composers. I had an affinity for Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. But I played it all: Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann, Schubert, Liszt, Ravel, Debussy, and on and on. So the only regret I have at that time was she was such a dominant personality. And, from the Asian culture, where we are very deferential to our teachers, they are always right. You don't question them. And so she really didn't let me think for myself. So I studied with her from age 9 till I graduated from high school, age 18. So I consider those years not lost, but I don't feel like I was my own person, It was basically her way or the highway in terms of how to play a song and what composers were, the great ones. And, but, I went to a performing arts high school in Houston, and that was a great experience, just getting to basically be with a whole bunch of, high school is not the easiest time. So we were all just a bunch of nerds in whatever art area we were in, because they also had dance, theater, media arts, vocals, jazz, visual art. So it was just, we were just basically geeking out on whatever we loved. And that was a really, I think, important experience to have. And I had every intention of wanting to be becoming a concert pianist. And since I'm the oldest of 4 of, practical family, although I did get some scholarships, my parents didn't want to go into debt for me to go to a fancy conservatory. And I remember feeling crushed because, that was the big thing when you're a senior in high school. Where are you going? People are going to Juilliard and Brown and Peabody and Eastman and places like that. And so I ended up going to the University of Texas at Austin, which was like my backup school.
What was your first choice?
I thought I wanted to go to Curtis. But I didn't make it in, so that was decided for me. I really didn't know, it was, my teacher was she had such a control over me. And so I went to UT. I was really bummed. I remember going to orientation. I just was like, couldn't care less about what was going on. I was just so bummed. So I started, but I had a good friend who also studied with this classical teacher I studied with. She was a year ahead of me. I don't think she was she had a more independence in herself, which I admired. And so I saw, okay, this is my lot. And, I got used to it and I got into it. And, and I was away from this lady, this Russian teacher. And then I think it was the end of my junior year, this friend of mine, she said to me, "Helen, we need to go hear Harry Connick Jr." And I didn't know who he was at that point because I was, typical classical pianist. I was always in the practice room. I was like 6 to 8 hours a day. The music building was right by the football stadium. I never went to a single football game. I mean, I was just like tunnel vision. And I was like, well, who's that and why? And she was like, oh, don't worry, Helen, he's hot. You'll like him. I said, okay.
That's a great reason to go hear somebody. Oh, they're hot.
And he's great. He had his big band, and yes, he was very handsome and very entertaining. But in the middle of the concert, he sat down and played some solo piano. And I remember feeling like I was struck by lightning, thinking, first of all, I didn't know you were allowed to play the piano like that. And second of all, what is this music that has such life in it that it just grabbed me in a way that classical never did? And so it was just a really pivotal moment. I mean, I wasn't thinking, forget classical, I want to do jazz. All I knew is I wanted to learn more about jazz. So I enrolled in a beginning jazz class for pianists, and the jazz piano professor at UT is very excellent. And I went to the music library and started checking out all sorts of books on jazz. I didn't know, I didn't know anything about the music. I didn't know anybody who, so luckily the books were good books, and I started listening to recordings and then gradually started taking all the classes that were offered. And, eventually it's like it's like these daily choices that put you, and all of a sudden you find yourself on this new path. And that's that. I was this experience I really credit with making me the kind of musician I am today. My parents were not happy that I was doing classical. They were like, okay, well, at least you can teach. We know that you can teach. And I remember thinking, I'm practicing so many hours a day. I want to play, And so then when I told them, I think I want to study jazz, they kind of lost it. I remember my dad yelled at me for like 2 hours, like, have you lost your mind? First of all, music is not a real profession, it's a hobby, all the typical things parents say. And so I stayed at UT and also got a master's degree in classical piano because they didn't offer a master's in jazz. And then after that, I'm like, as I was coming to the end of my master's degree, I'm like, well, what am I going to do? Should I go to New York? I don't feel ready. I don't want to go to school anymore. I'm sick of school. And then my dad was so upset. He said, you are going to apply for DMA programs. He says, I don't care. You have to apply for, and I was like, oh, okay. So I sent off for DMA brochures, and one of them was from the New England Conservatory. And as I opened the package on the brochure, it said, announcing the first Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz Performance program at NEC. It's 2-year diploma, completely paid for, scholarship, housing, room and housing, all paid for. They accept one person on each instrument to form a band, so a class of 7 students. So I didn't even dare to hope that I would get in, right? Because I'd been playing, 2 years, all of 2 years, maybe 2.5. I didn't know anything, but I sent off an audition tape and got in. I just, it was just that's what brought me to the East Coast. And it was just a incredible life-changing experience because the whole goal of that program was to have us learn under the masters of the music, because that's how jazz was taught up until then, from master to apprentice. So we didn't really have class. We would have these legends come work with us for a week, 2 weeks at a time. Our first teacher was Clark Terry. Then we had Jimmy Heath, Jackie McLean, Wynton Marsalis came. I mean, you name it, Curtis Fuller, Slide Hampton, Ron Carter was the artistic director. I mean, it was just dizzying. We went on tour with Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter. It was just, and Barry Harris, and that just put me on the path I am today, and I'm so grateful.
You talked about building a solid technique when you were coming through your formative years. What are some of the techniques that you were able to use from your classical upbringing and apply to your newfound love of jazz?
Well, all of it, and I was very fortunate to have a good technique and my first teacher at UT was very wise. He knew that I would have no problem playing the notes. It's just that jazz has a totally different approach to time, to rhythm, to how the music is performed and presented. So he set me first to just playing a lot of bebop heads, which was so crucial because bebop, the language of bebop, is the backbone foundation for jazz improvisation. So yeah, all of it. It's just I felt like I shelved a lot of the literature and just, I played all sorts of piano music. I played solo piano, chamber music, concertos, orchestral works that had piano in it. So the textures I was exposed to was just the whole gamut, right? But then jazz, for many years, I was just playing these single lines in my right hand and comping chords in the left hand and maybe stabbing a bass note and just, but now as I got, and also I remember feeling from the very beginning, I said, there's something about this music that is incredibly noble, incredibly profound, and demands the highest respect from anybody. And one of the marks that I felt, hallmarks of an authentic jazz musician, is really learning how to swing. So for many years, and I now see that swing is something you just keep chasing for the rest of your life. But for many years, that was just my focus, because I would record myself on my gigs, and I was like, it's not swinging, it doesn't sound right, it doesn't feel right. And it's because this whole it's so interesting now when I write arrangements that incorporate classical musicians and seeing how they approach time. It's completely different, and so technique-wise, playing the piano is playing the piano, whatever genre you want. But in terms of how the music is made, how you create it, that is completely different. So in terms of, at the beginning, the technical elements were totally all very relevant. And now as I'm no longer, I felt like I was thrown into the deep end of the pool and I was drowning. But now that I'm treading water and feeling more comfortable, it's all coming back, especially in composition and writing, textures, orchestrations, how I think about arrangements and forms, stuff like that.
You were talking about the improvisational elements, and just before our interview, you were having lunch, which we've all been learning how to cook a little bit better these days, how to make food at home, which I will say this. We just had our Chinese restaurants beginning to reopen here in the Lehigh Valley. We might have 4 or 5 open now among Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton. But outside of that, maybe one other meal a week, I've been trying to learn how to cook here at home. I mean, I'm a bachelor. Hungry man meals have been my salvation for years, or as I call them, lonely man meals. But anyway, but I'd like to think about an artist's voice as having particular ingredients, and in your case, the voice is not, as in your vocal folds, but we're talking about your piano, your performance technique. And I love to dig into how one defines their own sound, especially, how you improvise. I was listening to some of your earlier recordings from, say, about 15 years ago, and there has obviously been an evolution in the sound. But for a typical performance, it's hard to really blanket a definition. But what are the things that you seek to include? How do you define your voice when it comes to performance and the improvisation?
Well, I think I can sum it up really well with what many of the jazz masters I studied with said to us. They said, we want you to have a firm understanding and respect for the tradition, but we want you to move the music forward in as only you can. So I think sound is something that's ever evolving in terms of my sound, and not that I can pin it down and say this is it, but I know that when I play, I want the feeling of it being rooted to, and I'll say it, to the tradition. So there's something very authentic and grounded, but done in a way that's surprising and fresh, and creative,
How much of you is heard in your music?
Hopefully 100%.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So if it's not, how do you inject more of yourself into your music?
Well, I only know how to play like how I play. So I feel like when I play, I always give 100%. So I don't know any other way to play. So if you're asking me what I would tell a student, how do you inject more of yourself?
Sure.
One thing, when I was strictly a classical musician, I never thought like composing music was something that I considered the composer's realm, you know, people like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. But when I studied at the Monk Institute, Ron Carter was the artistic director, and he would meet with us once every couple of weeks. And he said, if you want to develop your own voice, you need to write music. And he didn't elaborate much beyond that. So every 2 weeks when he came, we had to have a new composition ready for him. But if I had to explain it to a student, I say, when you write music, one has to make choices. One does certain things in a certain way, and that's based on what they hear and what they like. And so that's injected into the composition. So I really think if somebody wants to inject more of their own personality, they should write their own music.
Do you find it challenging to write your own music?
Yes and no. It's like a birthing process. I mean, I've never had a kid, but I feel like some songs take forever there are songs that I still can't make right, and I can't bear to throw it out, so I'll just put it away in a file. There are some songs that take a good amount of just processing, and then there are songs that just come out right like that. So I think the arts, it defies, what's the word? Any kind of standardization, because I think a career in the arts, there's no formula, right? Like if you want to be a doctor, you take pre-med classes and you study for your MCATs, and then you go to med school, and then you do your residencies, and then you do blah, 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 and then you take your boards, and ta-da, you're a doctor or a lawyer. You go to pre-law, you go to law school, you take your, the bar exam, and ta-da, so music is just, there's principles. And I think this applies through in terms of whatever we're talking about. There are principles, like my teachers taught me what they did, what helped them, but that only goes so far, and the artist has to make that leap herself, make that leap himself, So that to me is the magic and the mystery.
Where do you find inspiration for writing?
Everywhere. It could be something I saw. I'm looking at these strange thunderclouds floating by. Mm-hmm. Could be a beautiful scene. It could be a painful experience. It could be a memory. It could be a groove. I've written songs that are inspired by a groove that I couldn't get out of my mind. It could be the quality of somebody's voice. It could be a color. I mean, I really love what Gil Goldstein, he's an incredible arranger, very incredibly talented pianist, accordionist, and just keyboardist. He was giving a composition class or master class, and he said, as composers, we're hearing stuff all the time, but occasionally there come, and I've had this experience, and I really agree with him. He said there are seeds of music that come into your consciousness that are meant just for you, and you need to be paying attention when they come. You need to grab them and birth it into whatever it's supposed to be. He said, because if you don't, it's going to pass on and not become music, or and I know that's such a mystical way of talking, but I love it. I think it's really true. It's really, yeah.
And I've heard a lot of people talk about musical performance, composition, the listening experience, all of those things being therapeutic, but also being akin to a spiritual experience. Would you agree that that's how you feel about your music?
Well, I feel that about all music, not just mine. Music is beyond words. It's abstract. Once you hear the sound, you played it, it's gone. But it's not also. So definitely, one of the many things I love about jazz music is the communal aspect of it. And I think that's really reflective of its roots and where it comes from. Because classical piano is very solitary. It's just the pianist in the practice room. Even if you're playing with an orchestra, they're just there to window dressing for you, but jazz at its core, it's about community. It's about making music together. And that is such a different experience, because I was so used to, I go on stage with my piece all prepared as well as I could, and this is how I want it to go. to jazz, where you are on stage with one other, two other, up to how many other people who hear jazz a little bit, hear music a little bit differently than you, who feel rhythm differently than you, and you have to come together and make music together. Like, that is a continual challenge for me, because it's, it's hard to be with other people. It's hard to live with other people, work with other people. But I really love what Jimmy Heath, the great tenor saxophonist, he said for him, the jazz stage was an example of true democracy, because everybody on there had their role. Everybody knew their role and had to fulfill it. Everybody got a chance to say what they needed to say. But in the end, they each together, they create something greater than they could do on their own.
And that sense of community is something that we are all struggling with right now, because we can't play together, not in the traditional sense, and may not be able to for some time. And I was reading a blog post, and we recorded this in early May, and there was a post that you made just a few days ago on your website, and it says, "May our faith sustain and connect us." What does that statement mean for you?
The longer I live, I think the less I understand about things like God and the different religions. So I didn't want to limit how people choose to connect with God, whatever they want to say, whatever they want to use, because I think that's for me the respectful thing to do. But I think faith takes us out of our me, myself, and my worries and my issues and problems and whatever, and gives us hopefully a bigger view of all of us, of the world, of our communities, of people. And if anything is needed right now, as we are all quarantined in our homes, is just the sense of staying connected and being connected to, first of all, to God, then, within ourselves and with other people. So that's why I said that, because I think we are all hurting and suffering in different ways. And I'm so grateful that music can be such a force for healing, and just beauty is healing, beauty and sound. So that's what I meant when I said that.
How has your own faith influenced your music and your outlook on how music influences your life?
I think if anything, because I'm a perfectionist, it's like a bad combination of things. Perfectionist, unrealistic expectations, all that stuff. I think it's as I just, I think a lot of life is about putting the pieces of healing yourself in a way, I think it's getting a greater sense of gratitude, because music is a gift. Being able to play music for a living is an incredible privilege and blessing. So I would say just a deep sense of just, I feel so lucky, thankful, like that this is how it worked out for me. Like, it didn't have to, so I'm grateful.
We were talking about your parents and their journey earlier, and I want to come back to that for this thought. There have been a number of influences upon your music. We talked about your faith, your studies, the shared mutual experiences with other musicians and mentors. But you are also unique in the fact of where your heritage comes from. And your parents' story and their own journey has greatly impacted yours. How has that piece of your life, your culture, how has that impacted you and your music?
Well, I think I'm just at the beginning of the journey in terms of that, because I was raised very much Americanized and felt really conflicted a lot of my life, because I felt like an American, whatever that means, on the inside, but I didn't look American on the outside. So it was a weird disconnect. In the past, I would say 3 to 5 years, I've started performing in China and Taiwan more. And it's been an incredibly moving experience. I remember when I played in Taiwan, my last name is Sung, and most people assume I'm Korean. So in fact, in the program for that festival, they said Korean pianist, Korean American pianist. And afterwards, I was like, who wrote that program? I said, I'm Chinese. And I remember there were these young Chinese jazz musicians and students. They were so excited. They're like, oh my God, you're one of us. And that was such an amazing moment for me because, I said, what is it like to live in China or in Taiwan where everybody looks like you or you look like everybody? I don't know. So I don't have an answer for that yet because I don't think I'm just starting. I feel like that part of me is starting to come together because I consider myself very much, they call us ABCs, American born Chinese. Yeah.
One final thought. Why music?
I remember when I was in middle school, and I don't know if I verbalized it to myself, but I remember thinking that music is something that I will never get to the bottom of. Like everything else, science, sorry, I speak in ignorance now because I know I don't mean to denigrate those other things at all. But for me at that moment, I felt like becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, like I would become bored eventually, but music is something that will be an endless fascination.
Helen Sung, our guest during In Studio from Simply Timeless. Visit her website, helensung.com, for more information on her recordings, compositions, and educational workshops. Special thanks to Helen for spending some of her time with us for this interview. We greatly appreciate the opportunity. And a word of thanks to you for joining us. Let's do this again next week. Until then, I'm Jay Daniels. Thanks for listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless.